Hello everyone and welcome to our Parent Carer workshop. My name is Kaylee and today I will be talking to you about strategies to support communication. Before we start out, it is important to remember that all the information provided in this presentation is general information about autism and how this presents in children based on both research and my personal experience of working with children with autism. So you may find that not all of this information applies to your child, and that is because all children with an autism diagnosis present differently. So we always say that once you've met one child with autism, you've only met one child with autism. So please bear this in mind when watching this presentation. So our plan for today, we're going to start by talking about executive functioning and how children with autism can process information differently. Then we will move on to building a strategy toolbox and looking at the strategies to help maximise communication with your child. The second half of this session will look at different learning styles that children can have and how we can use visuals and adapt the environment in order to aid communication. Throughout this presentation, if you do have any questions or would like clarification on any of the content, then please do email us at theautismservice@cognis.org.uk and someone will be back in touch with you with response to your question. So firstly, what is executive functioning? So this refers to the person's ability to process information. It includes skills such as organising, planning, paying attention and inhibiting inappropriate responses. Executive functioning is a term psychologists use to describe the many tasks our brains perform that are necessary to think, act and solve problems. Executive functioning includes tasks that help us to learn new information, remember and retrieve the information that we've learned in the past, and use this information to solve problems that we come across in everyday life. Many people with autism have difficulty with executive functioning, meaning that they may have trouble with certain skills such as planning, staying organised, sequencing information, and self-regulating emotions. Some people pay attention to minor details, but have trouble seeing how these details fit into a bigger picture. Others may have trouble maintaining their attention in the classroom or other settings, so it may seem that they are becoming distracted easily. When preparing to do a task, some people may find it hard to organise their thoughts and actions in order to figure out what sequence of steps are needed. So when completing a task, your child may find it difficult to work out how to complete the task in a logical way and may end up starting with perhaps the middle instruction rather than the beginning. And this all relates back to executive functioning. Also, executive functioning difficulties can be associated with poor impulse control. So you may have noticed that your child cannot wait and has to perform an action or a task as soon as they've thought of this. Or another example of this is that your child may say something without thinking, which may come across as being inappropriate or even sometimes rude. And again, that relates back to these difficulties with executive functioning that people with autism experience. Due to these executive functioning difficulties, this can also mean social communication can be difficult as it is more challenging to make sense of the conversations and interactions that are occurring. So these are just some characteristics that you may or may not have noticed in your children, which relates back to executive functioning and that may impact your child on a day-to-day basis. So let's think about our strategy toolbox and what we would want to include in this. To help support children with autism, we want to develop a strategy toolbox with these three elements. We want to be able to help maximise communication. We want to use visual supports to assist with communication and adapt the environment in an appropriate way for your child or children in order to help them feel safe and communicate in the most effective way. So this is a quote from Lawson, who has autism, to help explain what it's like to them when they are required to process information when communicating with other people. So they have said, I'm so often expected to process more than one thing at any one time. I find this demanding, and because it is so difficult to do, I can become anxious even thinking about the event. And I think this is a really nice way to sum up what processing information is like for someone with autism. Many pupils with autism find it difficult to interpret and understand information from more than one sense at a time. This can result, for example, in the child being unable to look and listen at the same time. So it's just useful to keep that in mind that processing information, in particular from more than one sense at one time, can be quite overwhelming for a child with autism. Moving on, let's think about how we can best communicate with children with autism. Firstly, looking at verbal communication. So when we communicate verbally, we want to be clear. We want to start by cueing the child in by using their name to gain their attention so that the child can be sure that you are speaking to them. Next, we want to think about reducing our verbal input. And by this, we mean sticking to key words. So if we think about a sentence, how many words in a sentence do you need to hear to actually make sense of what is being said? For example, Tommy, please can you put on your shoes and coat and get ready to leave? We could just use Tommy, shoes, coat, door. Although this seems a bit demanding and even rude, your child will find it easier to process 4 words rather than a whole sentence and will be more likely to follow the instructions. We also want to allow more time to process information. Going back to the previous slide, I've already mentioned that due to difficulties with executive functioning, a child with autism can find it difficult to process information, and often they need more time to help them process this information. So, for example, I once went on a course that was facilitated by a man with autism, and he explained how people with autism process information. He said that when someone started talking to him, his processing clock begins, and that tends to be slower than people expect, meaning there would often be a pause while he processed the information and produced the response. However, people often interpreted the pause as that this man had not understood what had been said. So the person talking to him would start by saying the same information again, but perhaps in a different way. This then restarted the processing clock again. Therefore, he suggested that people should just allow him time to process the information, and eventually he will produce a response after a slight delay. So that was a really useful thing for me to hear, because now when working with children with autism, I allow them to have that time to process. And sometimes it can mean sitting there for 30 seconds, perhaps up to 40 seconds, or even longer at times, for them to process this information. But if you do sit with the silence and wait, quite often, a majority of the time, the child does produce a response. We can also support our verbal communication with the use of visuals. For example, using post-it notes or perhaps a visual plan to help communicate what you are trying to say. We also want to be clear. Therefore, try and reduce the use of idioms and abstract language. So, for example, we use odd phrases such as, come on, pull your socks up, and these could be interpreted literally by a child with autism, and you may see them bending down and physically pulling up their socks. Also, if you're saying things such as, I'll be back in 5 minutes, hold on, you want to try and stick to this, because a child with autism may take this very literally rather than knowing that this means roughly 5 minutes once you finish the task. So they may even start counting down the 5 minutes and expect you to be back there. So being really clear and reducing the use of abstract language can really help a child with autism communicate effectively. Also, with our language, we want to focus on what you want your child to do. So, for example, saying stand still as opposed to stop moving. Direct the focus of your communication on the instruction that you'd like them to complete rather than what you'd like them to stop, highlighting that positive language as much as possible. And finally, we want to check in with your child's understanding. Have they actually understood what you've asked them? So quite often when I am working with autistic children, I will ask them to repeat back to me what I've said so I can check that they've processed what I've said, but also interpreted this in the way that I have intended. So thinking about all of these points on the slides and just holding these in mind to ensure that we are verbally communicating with children with autism and we are doing this in the most effective way possible. So here is an example that I really enjoy showing to parents because I think it sums up how idioms can be confusing and interpreted literally by your child. So in the picture, you can see that there is a dad, and one rainy day he says to his child, no, Sam, you can't spend your savings monies on toys and sweets. But dad, look, it's raining. The dad replies, whatever do you mean? And the child says, well, I've been saving my money for a rainy day, and here it is. So clearly, this dad has said to the child, save your pocket money for a rainy day, meaning to save it up and spending it on something that he saved for. But clearly, the child has interpreted this literally, and now that it is raining, he thinks he can spend it. And I think this example just shows, as human beings, how easy it is to use these phrases without really thinking about what it means. So just hold this in mind and thinking about how our language choices can be interpreted differently by a child with autism. So next we're going to think about communication in a bit more detail and how we can best support your child to communicate. So we want to be able to create the need to communicate, and we want to encourage your child to communicate at all times. So thinking about in younger children, this might involve the use of picture symbols or using their special interests to get them to communicate. So for example, if they want food, get them to ask you for food instead of them just pointing at it, or you as parents or carers reading their signals that they are hungry and that signal means that they want food. Getting them to respond to your questions, such as what do you want, and encouraging them to communicate with yourselves and other people in your household will get them practicing using those communication skills, and they'll feel more confident in doing this. Again, you want to be explicit about expectations. So instead of telling them no, tell them what it is you want them to do. Because if you're just using the word no, they know that they're doing something that perhaps is not right, but they are not being told what they should be doing in order to rectify this. So again, being clear with your child about what you would like them to do and checking in with them that they are aware of these expectations by getting them to perhaps repeat back to you what you've asked them so that you can check their understanding. And if your child has not understood, then think about perhaps using visuals to support this and what type of language you as a parent are using. We also want to think about breaking down instructions. So thinking about wash hands, dry hands, sit down. By saying this, it is very clear for the child and they are aware of the order that they are asked to complete the task in, and it is straight to the point. There's no extra language or unnecessary extra language that they have to process, and this message then may be lost. So a visual resource that we can use to help support your child and their communication is the now and then visual. So thinking about that example that I just gave about wash hands, dry hands, sit down, this could also be shown in a visual form using the now and then layout. So first we're going to wash hands and then we will dry hands. So this is a very simple visual that could be used to support your verbal communication and help your child process what is being asked of them. It is also important to acknowledge appropriate responses, so praising your child for the things that they've done well, but also being specific about what they have done well so they are sure about this and can repeat the action next time. So for example, we want to say good sitting rather than good boy, because then this means that the child knows that what they have done good is the sitting. We also want to be able to limit our choices. So too much choices can be overwhelming for a child with autism. So I once worked with a child who, after school on a Friday, would, as a treat, get to go to the sweet shop and could choose a sweet. But when he had the choice of the whole sweet shop, this made him really anxious and overwhelmed, and as a result, he ended up having a meltdown in the shop. So something that was meant to be a positive experience turned out to be the opposite. Therefore, limiting choices can be reassuring for your children. So next week, when the child went back to the shop, his parents gave him the choice of two sweets, and this was much more manageable for him. So this is just to reiterate that when communicating with your child, you want to do this in a way that the information can be processed easily, and limiting the amount of information available at one time can be a useful tool to help support this. So next, let's have a think about how we can teach children communication skills. Firstly, the use of role play can be really beneficial. For example, this could be used to practice meeting various people and to ensure that they respond in appropriate ways. So for example, practicing the differences between greeting a head teacher versus a family member and someone of authority such as a policeman or woman. So role play can be a really useful tool here, and going back to executive functioning, children with autism can sometimes find it difficult to respond to different levels of authority as they have not processed the difference between these roles. Therefore, practicing this at home and through role play can be a good way to learn these differences between people and their role. Next, teaching turn taking in conversations can be a useful tool for children with autism. You can teach this by using an object or a toy that has to be passed around in a group, and they can only talk when holding the toy. This allows the child to listen to other people and then respond after this. And in turn, this will help them to learn those social rules of turn taking in a conversation. We can also help with appropriate topics for your child to talk about and bring up when talking to their peers and new people. To do this, you could use an interest box with topics and get your child to talk about a topic that they choose out of the box. This also helps your child to think about making conversations on different topics, especially when they're on the spot and having to improvise. Hopefully, in turn, this will help to reduce the anxiety the child may feel when talking to new people. So these are just some points to hold in mind which may help your child communicate effectively. As humans, we all see things differently. For example, looking at this image, what can you see? Do you see an apple that's been eaten? Or do you see two faces looking at each other? So this image shows how people can receive the same information but interpret this differently. Therefore, it is important that when we are communicating, we are being clear about what we are trying to say and what we want to happen. So next, we're going to move on and think about how we can communicate using other methods than verbal communication. A way to help ensure that we are communicating effectively and in the best possible way is to think about how your child learns best. What kind of learner are they? So are they an auditory learner? Do they learn best from listening to something, perhaps verbal information or podcasts? Or are they a visual learner? Do they learn best from information being presented in pictures or seeing things drawn out? Or we have a kinesthetic learner. Do they learn best from doing or creating things? Your child may also be a mixture of different learning styles, so you may be able to fluctuate or combine these learning styles together. So, for example, using visuals and spoken words can strengthen the communication. As humans, we all learn best in different ways, so you yourself will probably find that you are stronger in one of these areas. So, for me personally, I'm definitely a visual learner. Thinking back to school, I always needed to see something drawn out on the board and visual explanation of how to work something out. So think about this in relation to your own child and how do they learn best, as this will give you a great insight into the best way to communicate with them. So now let's think about visuals and how these are used in everyday life. So what visuals can you think of that you see and use every day? Just take a minute to think about all the visuals that you may come across or see on a daily basis. So here are some examples of visuals that you may have thought of. So we have traffic lights, toilet symbols, road signs, social media symbols. So down the bottom there we have Twitter and Facebook. And these are all visual symbols that we see on a daily basis and just know and understand. They do not require any verbal or written information to go with them in order to help us to know what they mean. We've just learnt these symbols growing up and their representation. Another great thing about these visuals is that they are universal and can be translated across different environments. So, for example, once your child has learnt a symbol or a visual, they'll be able to recognise this in other environments, which will be great because they can use these, for example, both at home and at school. So, why are visuals vital when we are talking about children with autism? So, research has shown that many children with autism are visual learners. Therefore, visual supports can help them and help you to communicate with them. So visual supports help to give the child a visual representation which will help them to hold on to that thought. Visuals can also help to reduce anxiety because when information is presented as a picture, it is presented all in one go. So they know that there is nothing else that's going to be coming which they have to then process. Also, if they can process visuals better, then this reduces anxiety as they understand what is being asked of them. So if we're thinking back to earlier when we discussed executive functioning, children with autism can have slower processing speeds, and it can be difficult to hold on and process the beginning of the sentence whilst trying to listen to the rest of the sentence. Therefore, by presenting the information as a visual, this is presented all in one go, and the child can refer back to this if they need to. Visuals can also be used to promote greater independence. So thinking as your child becomes older, they can then be given visuals and work out how to complete the task themselves. Visuals can also be used to prepare them for future tasks. So for example, if we're thinking about children going to secondary school, they may want to get the bus on their own. So this could be quite an anxiety provoking task. For example, trying to remember which bus to get on, where to get off, the name of the stop. Therefore, visuals can be used to support them through this and can be a reference point for them to look back on if they become unsure or anxious. And this can all be done subtly on a mobile phone. For example, you could, before they start getting the bus to secondary school, you could take pictures of the bus stop and the bus that they're meant to get on so that your child can check that they are standing in the correct place. Therefore, this promotes greater independence as they have not got to rely on you as parents. Research has also shown other benefits of using visuals with children with autism. So, alongside supporting understanding and learning, visuals have also been shown to reduce aggression. The reason for this is because when children do not understand something, this can make them feel anxious, and the way of managing this feeling is through aggression. If children can process and understand what is being asked of them, then they feel calmer, safe, and contained because they can understand what is going on. Again, adjusting to change of routine and being more accepting to these changes. Visuals can be used to support with this also. Visuals help explain in a way that the child understands why the plan has changed and what will happen next instead, which makes the child feel more contained and in control. So this just highlights how visuals can be beneficial in other areas as well as learning and understanding. So now let's start to look at some examples of visuals that we can use with your children on a daily basis. So firstly, an individual visual timetable. These can be color coded, words or images of perhaps the subjects or the activities that you're going to be completing in that day. So these timetables help to show a child what will be happening each day at school or home, which in turn then helps to reduce anxiety as they can prepare for what will be happening next. They know what is coming up and there are no surprises. So I personally prefer to use a visual timetable that has an image associated with each subject with the word written underneath. So for example, for English, I might have a book with the word English written underneath. Also, when I make these, I tend to make small subject symbols, so like little squares, which are laminated and then have Velcro on the back. These can then be stuck onto a timetable each day, and the child can rip these off once they have completed the lesson, which gives a feeling of satisfaction and achievement that they have completed the task. Also, something to think about is how much information is presented on the timetable in one go. So for example, the timetable could be hourly if you feel any more information would be overwhelming for your child, or perhaps daily or weekly if your child is able to process more information. So I personally prefer to create a daily timetable so that the child is aware of what they will be asked each day. And I find weekly can sometimes be too overwhelming for a lot of children. But if you feel like this would work best for your child, then that's great. Also, by doing a weekly routine, it is likely at some point the plan will change. And as we mentioned previously, for a child with autism, a change to a plan can cause increased anxiety. Whereas completing a daily timetable, it's less likely that there will be changes to this. But I want you to remember that you, as the parents and carers of your children, are the experts of your children. So you will know how much information they can tolerate in one go. So what I suggest is just go with your gut because you know your children best. So you can also create a visual for home routines. So this is an example of the bedtime routine to highlight to your child what is expected of them and the stages that they need to complete before bedtime. So again, this could be created on Velcro tokens, and each stage is a Velcro token, and your child can rip this off once they've completed it. So again, these can be really beneficial to use at home, especially if your child does not like bedtime, and in a way this can be created into a game or a challenge. So a lot of children I've used these with enjoy the satisfaction of pulling off the token once they've completed the stage, so you can make this into a fun activity before bed. Also, for some children, this may need to include timings. So I found when running these parent groups and talking to parents that children can spend too long on one area or not enough time washing or brushing their teeth. Therefore, the use of timings can help to guide this. So this can be in either the form of an egg timer or using specific times like at 6 p.m. we get undressed and put on our pajamas, 6:15 we wash our face, etc. So using the exact timings. But again, this is down to what works best for each child and your family routine. So if, for example, your timings that you go to bed alter each night, then it might be worth more using the timer option than specific timings because otherwise you'll need to alter this each night. And here is another example of the morning routine. And again, this could be used for the whole morning or just one part. So I just wanted to show you this, how routines can be broken down even more. So for example, making breakfast or lunch. You can see on the images on the slide, which show you how to make a sandwich. And this just demonstrates how one task can be broken down using visuals. So just being noticing how much information do you think your child can process at one time, and using this effectively. So can your child process a whole routine, or does this need to be broken down into smaller sections? And I know I have mentioned about using Velcro symbols that can be stuck onto a timetable, but I just wanted to show you this example and highlight that you haven't always got to create a fancy visual timetable. So this is an example of one that's just been created on post-it notes and can still be just as effective. So this is an example of parents who work shift work and showing the child who was going to be there when he woke up and who was going to be there when he went to bed. So it's about just getting the information across in the best possible way, not necessarily how it is presented. Just as long as it is clear and in an understandable format, that is okay. And here is another example of how you can use a simple visual aid even without drawing pictures. So if you're not creative and don't like drawing, then don't worry. So this is what I use when working with a child to outline what we will be covering in the session and the order in which this will be happening. And again, this has the same effect as using the tokens, as the child can tick off once they've completed that part of the session. So this is just to highlight that you don't have to use anything fancy to support your child's communication, but using this prepares the child for what is going to happen and eases anxiety. I also mentioned earlier how the use of a timer can be beneficial, as this helps to keep tasks boundaries. So the use of a timer means that children know what to expect, they know how long the task is going to be, and they have a visual representation of when the task is going to finish. Also, my personal experience of working with children with autism and using timers, I found that children are more receptive to listening to the timer and packing away a task once the timer is finished, compared to when I've asked them to stop the activity that they're doing. And I think this relates back to the fact that the timer is a visual source of how long they've got left, and the instruction isn't coming from me, it's coming from the timer. So just bear in mind and think about where in perhaps your child's day-to-day routine you could use a timer. Could this be when brushing your teeth? Could this be when managing time on the iPad, a countdown before bedtime? So this can be a really useful tool if it's used effectively in the day-to-day routine. So now, at home, have a think about a routine that your child may benefit from being described using a visual timetable or visual aid of some sort. So some examples of this could be the morning routine, bedtime routine, or perhaps going out on a new trip or for dinner at the weekend. So we've spent some time thinking about visuals and how these can be used to support your child's communication. So another factor we want to think about is supporting your child to make choices. Making choices can be very overwhelming for children with autism and can evoke a feeling of anxiety. So, for example, thinking back to the example I gave earlier in the presentation about the child in the sweet shop who was overwhelmed by the choice he had. So just thinking about in relation to your child, have a think about where you could perhaps minimize choice, or there have been times where you've noticed that too much choice has been overwhelming for your child. Also, think about how you give those choices. Children like to feel in control, so you can use this to your advantage. So, for example, if your children need to complete perhaps 10 sums for their maths homework, you could give them a choice. You could say to them, would you like to complete 15 or 10 sums? They'll normally always choose the 10, but that's all they needed to do. But they will feel like that they've won and they're in control because they got the easier option, but actually you did. It's just about minimizing those choices, probably around 2 or 3 options, and making sure that the options you are giving them are available and you're happy for them to engage in those options. In turn, this will make your child feel in control of their decisions and more contained. So here is an example of a choice board which you could present to your child, displaying the available choices. But remember to only give your children choices of activities that you would actually be able to do. So for example, don't choose swimming if the swimming pool isn't open that day, as this may cause your child to be disappointed and upset. So we've spent a lot of time during this presentation talking about preparing your child, letting them know what will be happening, in which order, and following routines. But what do we do when something changes? And in the world that we live in, sometimes plans have to change. So for example, the train might be late. So instead of getting the 3:22, you have to get the 3:41. So these types of changes are out of our control. But for children with autism, they find it difficult to understand this. And parents I've worked with have said that their child has blamed them for this, which can be very difficult. So what can we do when the plan changes? So sometimes I found using a whoops card to be beneficial. So when something goes wrong, making a joke out of this and saying to your child, whoops, I think we might need to use that whoops card. Get them to stick this on the timetable and be sure to tell them what will happen instead, as the unknown can cause anxiety. Although you can prepare your young person when everything is going well, it is important that you practice what to do when something goes wrong. So it may also be useful to have a plan B for situations that are likely to come up at some point in the child's life. For example, thinking about if they're late for school. So you might want to practice saying to your child, if you're late for school, what will happen is I'll take you to the school office instead of the playground, and the office staff will then take you to your classroom ready for registration. This way, your child is prepared for the situation if it occurs. And because of the world that we live in, there are changes. But if you have prepared your child and practice these situations, then these will be much more manageable for your child. So on the slide, there's also a list of other situations which might be useful to think about having a plan B option for. So thinking about if someone else picks them up from school, if something is cancelled, the bus diverting, if you forget your homework or perhaps PE kit. So yeah, just have a think about those situations on the slide, and if you can prepare your child with the plan Bs, as this will help them to manage this change. Another way that we can support communication for children with autism is by using social scripts, as these can also be helpful in preparing your child for an outing to an unknown place. So, for example, if they're going on a school trip or perhaps a day out at the weekend to a new environment. So, using a social script will help to prepare the child in terms of what will happen and what they should expect. So here is an example for a school trip to a music recital. So this outlines what the child will be doing and the order they'll be doing those activities in. So for example, they're going to get on the coach first, then they're going to arrive at Fairfield Halls, go to the toilet, find their space to wait, practice their music recital, line up to go on stage, do the performance, go back to the space to wait, get on the coach, arrive back at school, and then go home. And these can be adapted to suit the child. So, for example, for some children, you may need to be a bit more specific. For example, adding in the timings of which each of these stages will be completed at. But think about using timings and how your child will respond to these. So, for example, we know coaches aim to leave perhaps by 8 a.m. But if people are running late, then it may leave later. So, would this make your child more anxious that they were running late as opposed to not knowing when the coach was due to leave? So, that's just something useful to hold in mind. It can also be useful if the pictures are of the real place. So quite often you can get these off websites, and a lot of places also do virtual tours, which could be useful for your child to see exactly where they're going to go and what to expect. So thinking about places like Chesterton World Adventures and museums, I know that parents have told me that they do these virtual 3D tours. So there's someone walking around the theme park with a camera, so your child knows what to expect before they arrive. They've seen it all on the camera, and that can be really helpful in easing their anxiety. For the last part of this presentation, I wanted to think about how we can effectively adapt the environment to help support your children. So thinking about both the physical environment and personal environment. So firstly, let's take the physical environment. So think about using visuals to help outline the physical environment and create those boundaries. So for example, using like no entry signs, start and finish signs when completing tasks. So this can help to support your child's understanding of what they're required to do, and when and where they're meant to be going. So think about those physical boundaries. Also thinking about them personally. So are they hungry, perhaps thirsty or tired? So these personal states can really impact a child and their behaviour, and it's important to take this into account when asking them to complete tasks, especially if these are activities that they don't really enjoy doing, such as homework. So when children finish school, they may be tired and hungry. Therefore, as soon as you get home, it may not be the right time to insist that they complete their homework. Instead, you may have more of a success rate after dinner once you've allowed your child to relax and have eaten. So this is useful to bear in mind and just consider their personal state that your child is in and whether this is impacting their behaviour. Also, thinking about the environment at home, does your child have a safe space where they can go to have peace and distance themselves from what's going on around them, especially when perhaps they're overwhelmed? So, when thinking about the physical environment, it is good to find a space where your child can go off to and have some alone time. And this doesn't need to be anything fancy, it could just be under a blanket in their bedroom. But having somewhere that is protected for them and is safe will help them to remove themselves when they feel anxious, stressed, or perhaps overwhelmed. So the pictures on the screen are just to show some possible ideas of creating a safe space. So for example, using a tent, or the middle picture is something that was created in a school. So it's simply just a table with a black cloth around it. So this doesn't have to be anything fancy or extravagant, just a safe space for your child. And perhaps think about an agreement with your child about when you, as a parent or a carer, can approach them in their safe space, or do they have a signal when it's okay for you to enter into this? It is also important to keep positive. It can be easy to focus on the negatives and the stresses that you've experienced in day to day life, but there will always be a positive to the day, even if it doesn't always feel like this. So find something each day to praise your child and be specific about this praise. Say, well done for sitting quietly instead of just well done for the day. So, in order for your child to repeat the action, they need to know specifically what they did, which was good. If you have made a negative comment in the day, try and increase your praise to ensure that your child receives an overall positive message. The ratio that we tend to say is 3 positive statements for 1 negative statement. Also, you can think about giving your child some responsibilities to help them feel in control. And also, you can use this to your advantage. So, for example, when at the supermarket, this can be a difficult experience for a child with autism due to the sensory overload. By making them in charge of a list and the ones being in charge to tick this off when you've collected the item, having this responsibility may help distract them from the chore of shopping. Again, if your child finds going to school difficult, you could speak to the school about them having a job which they could complete in the morning. This will then have them focused on the job rather than going into school. And that was actually an idea that a parent from one of the parent groups had suggested. And they said that their child, by having this responsibility at school, it really helped him to go into school each day. So trying to praise your child as much as you can keep things positive, and that can really lift yours and your child's mood. Also, thinking about the use of rewards. These can be useful if they're used in the correct way. So you want to ensure that you're not setting your child up to fail. For example, you want to ensure that the rewards and goals are achievable for your child and that they always receive a prize or a reward at the end of the week to reinforce the good work that they've done. So personally, I found the best form of rewards is by collecting stars throughout the week, and then at the end of the week you count how many the child has collected, and this amounts to either a small, medium, or large reward. So, for example, if they get between 1 and 5 stars, this would be a small reward. 5 and 10 stars, this would be a medium reward, and 10 plus would be a large reward. And these rewards should be decided before the week begins, and both with you and the child. So sit down with your child and decide what would be a small prize, what would be a medium prize, and what would be a large prize. So, for example, a small prize may be watching a film, a medium reward may be going to the sweet shop, and a large reward may be a cinema trip. So, this method means that you're not setting your child up to fail because they will always receive a reward at the end of the week, but this will give them the opportunity to aim higher the next week. And when you give them their reward, remind them why they have achieved this. For example, I'm giving you this because you showed good sitting or you helped to lay the table that day. Be specific. Also, the use of visual stars work well so that the child can see these building up and what they have achieved over the week. Finally, the last point I want to note about rewards is it is important that you do not take away their stars or tokens, however you're going to collect their achievements in the week, that they've earned if they display some negative behaviour. So there was a point in the week where your child did earn that star, and they should be rewarded for that. So instead of punishing for negative or bad behaviour, you should just not reward it. And finally, I just wanted to end on this nice quote that was said by Albert Einstein. So he stated that everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid. So I just wanted to highlight that everyone is a genius in their own way, but you need to judge this child by their ability. And I think that's really useful to hold in mind when thinking about autistic children. So thank you for listening today. I hope that has been helpful. But again, like I said at the beginning, if you do have any questions or would like any clarification on the topics that were covered today, then please do email the Autism Service at theautismservice@cognis.org.uk, and someone will be in response to your query. Your feedback on this session is greatly appreciated in order for us to improve our service for other parents and carers. If you do have a spare 2 minutes to follow the link on the slide and fill out the feedback form, that would be great. The link is also in the description of the video if you're unable to access it via the slide. Once again, I want to thank you for joining me today, and I hope this has been a helpful experience for you.